Rule of thirds is a visual composition technique that is used in a lot of art forms, including photography, design, and paintings. In this video, we'll take a detailed look at what this principle is and also see how this can be applied in the realm of architecture. I'm Salman, an architect and an illustrator. If you're new to the channel, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell icon for notification. So let's get started. So what is rule of thirds? Rule of thirds is a guideline that suggests dividing an image or canvas into 9 equal parts by drawing 2 equally spaced horizontal and vertical lines, creating a grid of 9 rectangles. The main idea behind this is to position the key elements of interest along the grid lines or at their intersections. By doing so, the composition becomes more balanced, dynamic, and visually appealing. When you place your subjects directly in the center at all times, it can be too static and less engaging, so this technique becomes an alternative. It allows the viewer's eyes to visually move around the composition, explore different areas, and also create a visually engaging experience. Additionally, the rule of thirds can be used to create a sense of hierarchy and emphasize certain elements in the composition. Now, let's look at different ways in which we can use the rule of thirds in architecture and design. Number 1, we can use this in our presentation sheets. Composing a sheet presentation is something that is very less talked about in architecture school as well as in the professional environment. One way to quickly come up with a highly balanced design sheet is to use rule of thirds. As the principle says, we can divide our sheets into 2 vertical and horizontal lines. Now, we'll have to arrange our diagrams along these grids or within these grids based on the hierarchy of the diagram and its orientation. Let's take an example of a design presentation of a villa. The elevation view can be placed at the intersection lines and can take about 4 grids of the section. The plans can take up 2 grids, sections can be placed in 1 grid, and the other supporting views can take up 2 grids. Here are some examples of sheet composition templates with rule of thirds applied on them. This way, we can save a lot of time in the sheet composition and also be confident that the sheet is balanced and harmonious. The second way to use this technique is in sketching. A common problem that most people face when sketching from a reference image or from a live location is that they start from one point and they end up putting all the elements of the building together. This results in losing the space on the sheet or sometimes missing the proportion of the building that they're trying to draw. The simplest way to resolve this is to use a composition technique before starting the sketch. The rule of thirds technique is especially useful when you're drawing a building which is in 2-point perspective or at a specific angle. Simply divide your sheet roughly into 9 grids and compose your sketch around it. Here's an example of a building that I've sketched from a location which was a storefront with a clock tower. I made the tower to fall in the intersection of the grids and the storefront along the bottom of the horizontal grids. If I had made this symmetrical, it might have looked odd, but right now it looks balanced. The next one is pretty obvious, which is architecture photography. Every photographer knows or must have heard about rule of thirds, and this rule can be applied in architecture photography to get more balanced and dynamic compositions. Even as a mobile photographer, you have the option to turn on the grids on your mobile phone. Let's look at an example of a photograph which has used this technique. This composition of Marina Bay in Singapore uses the top and bottom horizontal lines of the grid to frame the structures. This creates a more interesting image than if the photographer had placed the horizontal line in the center of the photo. To take your photography to the next level, you can apply this along with other visual principles to unlock a great potential. For example, this image uses rule of thirds and negative space, whereas this image uses rule of thirds with the principle of contrast. The fourth scenario is where you can use this principle in interior design. There are many ways to use this principle in interior design, though not literally but visually to some extent. Let's have a look at some examples to see how it's done. Interior designer Alice Lane employed the rule of thirds in this kitchen with kitchen lighting ideas. Notice how the countertop creates a horizontal line at the first third and the pendant lights are positioned at the intersection of the points for visual interest and perfect balance. Another example is of this open kitchen shelving idea. In this example, the shelves delineate the top horizontal and the 2 wall lights sit at the grid's top intersection, thus creating that ideal balance. Living room ideas can be used in the rule of thirds, and this one shows how to utilize your artwork for the perfect placement. Each end of the piece sits just outside the vertical intersection on the hypothetical rule of third grids. The last scenario where you can apply this technique is in 3D visualization. So just like photography, you can adjust the angle of your 3D renderings inside Lumion or V-Ray to achieve the effect of rule of thirds. It can be especially used while composing 3D visuals of elevation designs, where you can play around with the technique to create a point of interest. Here are examples of this technique being used in renderings by Ronen Beckerman. I found these to be very interesting. This can also be used in interior visualizations, where you can lead the eye of the viewer along the frame. This technique also works well in low-angle bird eye shots. So now that we've understood this rule, let's take a step back and understand not to take it too seriously. The rule of thirds is only a visual composition technique and it does not need to be applied everywhere. Symmetry is not bad either, and nor is breaking the rules of composition. The rule of thirds was only put in place so that people understand that symmetry is not the only way of composition, and you can use other odd techniques and make your image more interesting. So that's it from this video. I hope you liked this content, and if you did, please hit that like button and share it with your friends. You can follow me on Instagram for more such architectural content, and the handle is right here. I'll see you on the next one.